Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dominic Hobson of Hobson Cardew. We're an independent consulting firm. We research and write about post-trade issues, and it's my privilege to moderate this session on the related fields of financial crime compliance and cyber risk. Now, cyber risk is a relatively new problem. It's about as old as the internet, although what used to be a nuisance is rapidly becoming highly disruptive. Financial crime, on the other hand, is not a new problem at all. Regulators have been asking banks to help them solve money laundering for 50 years now, and the financing of terrorism for 20. But most of their efforts, and most of the efforts of the criminals, were focused not on the securities industry, but on cash. Now, the reason this session matters is that the attention, both of the criminals and of the regulators, is switching from cash to securities. And if you fail to mitigate these risks, two bad things are likely to happen to you. First, criminals will steal your customers' property. Secondly, regulators will fine you for allowing criminals to steal your customers' property. On the other hand, it's not easy to work out how to comply with the various recommendations which come out from an astonishing range of bodies. For example, the 40 recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force on combating money laundering and the financing of terrorism. How on earth do you apply those to your day-to-day business activities? Now, fortunately, ISSA has been doing the work for you. ISSA's had twin working groups focused on financial crime and cyber attacks, many of which are designed, of course, to steal financial assets for 4 years now. And there are multiple frameworks in existence now on cybersecurity, referred to in ISSA documents, which you'll find on the ISSA website. On the financial crime side, the work of the body has been now distilled into these financial crime compliance principles for securities custody and settlement. And you could read that document. It won't take you long, unlike a lot of the things in this field. It's short and to the point and based upon real business practice. Now, to help us understand all of this, and how you can apply these various findings to your business, I'm joined by Colin Parry, who is the CEO of ISSA, by Andy Smith, who is Chief Risk Officer for Operations at BNY Mellon. He's a member of the ISSA Operating Committee and also the leader of the ISSA Working Group on Cyber Risks in Securities Services. Andrew Gray is Group Chief Risk Officer at DTCC and a member of the Executive Board of ISSA. And last but not least, Mark Jem, Chairman of the Risk Committee at Clearstream and a leader of the ISSA Working Group on Financial Crime Compliance. Now, these are four extremely well-informed people. They're completely on top of this subject, as you can see from the confident look on their faces. But even they cannot handle a topic as large and complicated as this without your help. So we're going to be inviting you, the audience, to tell us what you know as well. And we're going to ask you quite often during the course of this session, so I'm glad you're all here, and I hope you're all on top of the Swift Cybos app, because we're going to ask you to vote using Slido. Now, to do that, you obviously have to have downloaded this app onto your phone. If you haven't done it before, log into the app using your email address and your password. Go to the More tab at the bottom, select Interact with Sessions, choose this conference room. That's conference room Swift number 1, and there you'll find all the questions in Slido. So if you haven't got the app, please download it straight away, because it'll be hard for you to participate in this session without having that in your phones. And once you've got the questions up, just start answering them immediately, because we don't have very long, and it would be good for you to get on with giving us your opinion as soon as you can. Now, I think we could start, in fact, by putting up our first question. Please, could you put the first question up? This first question is going to be asking your level of awareness about cyber risk and financial crime. And while you're getting on with answering that, we're going to ask our colleagues at the back to put up a slide which we prepared, which gives a flavour. Perhaps, Mark, I think you'd like to talk to this slide to give we tried to be discreet in this, haven't we? But it gives a flavour of what's going on in the world.
Yeah, let's do that. We're only going to show one slide. That's good, right? What this is seeking to show is how financial crime and cyber interact. Now, the color codes show the transparency index, the perceived corruption levels of various countries around the world, with blue being somewhat low, red being somewhat high. And that broadly maps to what most firms would rate countries for AML risk. What the green, dark green dots are the number of cyber attacks in the public domain that have resulted in asset theft, specifically people getting inside bank systems and remitting SWIFT messages predominantly to their correspondents in New York or in the European Union, with the result that money has gone. And these are the attacks that are in the public domain, about 35 of them over the course of the last 5 years. That is a very, very significant underestimate compared to those that we also know about but can't tell you about. What is the learning point from this slide is where a country, a correspondent, is located in a jurisdiction which you would classify as high risk for AML, there is also a heightened risk that they're penetrated by cyber criminals whose aim it is to steal money. And very often those groups are state-sponsored actors as well.
Thanks, Mark. Could we bring up the results of the first question? Carry on voting if you haven't voted yet on this question. It should be fun, but this indicates getting on for half our audience wasn't there last year. So awareness has increased, which is good. Nobody is admitting that their awareness has gone down over the last year. Andy, what's your
Well, I think that's a good result. And hopefully some of the work that we have been doing with the industry through the ISSA working group has been somewhat helpful. I'm not surprised because the focus on cybersecurity, the need for building plans to be resilient to cyber attacks has only increased over the last few years. And in a panel I was on earlier on today, we talked about that. So I think it's good, but frankly not surprising because I think we're all in a position where we need to continue to be vigilant. The threats aren't going away. The frequency of the attacks, the sophistication of the attacks, the impact of the attacks has only increased over time. So we have to make sure that we're prepared to protect our businesses against cyber attacks.
I'd also say that the maturity of the SWIFT CSP program has also helped from a preparedness perspective as well. Everything that's really helped us, and I think that's probably helped people and firms understand the potential for cyber attack and what we need to do about it as well. I think that's a big part of improving that awareness. And I think Mark, when you go back to your previous slide, when we were looking at the different parts of the world we see cyber attacks, I think when you use the results of the SWIFT CSP, which help us help us understand the preparedness of our counterparties, but you also look at the parts of the world that the attacks come from. It helps you in your risk-based decisions. It's part of your risk assessment process, and I think that's been very helpful. But that really kind of relates back to your point earlier that AML and cyber do have a degree of similarity when it comes to risk mitigation and governance.
Absolutely. I think what interests me about that result is that I think a lot of people are really aware of the risks that CSP was designed to mitigate in the payment space a year ago. And we were kind of, look at those payments guys, they have a problem. But it's kind of interesting that around 40% of all SWIFT payment messages are securities related. And that's by number. By value, the securities community generates way in excess of 50%. Right. We also deal in very large transaction sizes, an amount that would be surprising to a correspondent bank, a few million, for us is small change. It's only in the securities space where people routinely talk in billions and tens of billions. And equally, if you think about corporate events, you know exactly to the second when very large redemption payments, say on benchmark products, are going to be paid in any given system. So we have vulnerabilities to this that perhaps we were slow to recognize a year ago.
But I think in the
I've got a question on this, just before you go on. Could we, I'll come back to you in a minute, Andrew. Could we have the second and third questions up now, please? The results of those. What I was going to ask is, when you look at the data for the reporting of suspicious transactions, there's plenty of it being reported on the payment side, but actually the levels on the security side are much, much lower. And what explains that?
Yeah, I'm not so sure if that's true. If you look at the real data,
You're accusing me of manipulating data, Andrew?
No.
No, this is American data.
It's a question of what's actually reported, right? But I think I was about to say that in the paper, the working paper we put together, we pointed out the risks on the security side as being as significant as on the payment side as well. And I think that was one of the things we wanted to emphasize.
I just wonder if it's being underreported on the security side, that's all. Because I'm seeing here, I'm looking at the number of suspicious transaction reports filed in the United States, and securities as a percentage of the total is like 1%.
Okay.
It's 99%.
That is partly because somebody doesn't turn up with a suitcase with a bunch of securities in them because the
not
bearer
these
bond
days.
market is strong.
Used to happen in Luxembourg all the time, didn't it, Mark?
It did.
But I will say that the risk is significant as well on the security side. So, Andy.
Yeah, no, I think it is, and I think there's really a curve here. I mean, I think we've certainly seen, plenty of cyber attacks on the payment side, but I think when we looked at our curve and when you looked at our ISSA document, we felt that there was, whilst it hasn't happened yet, we think there is, certainly the threat, the vulnerability is there, and it certainly could happen. And we set out some specific examples where we thought it was, most likely to happen next. Free deliveries, standing instruction databases, that sort of thing. But we also do believe that there's, when you look at what could be the most systemically important, it's a disruptive event, and we see various disruption events happening throughout financial services at the moment.
Yep.
Yeah.
But Dominic, to answer, one answer to that is there's a whole bunch of money laundering reports coming from retail and so on, but they're going to tend to be very low value. In securities and money laundering reports, generally it's because it's a high value transaction. So you've got to correct the data for that. And I think our fear, Andy, is the same could be true in cyber. A lot of these attacks now, I think people will tell you that because the payment banks have put up defenses, the average value that people are trying to steal is falling. So could the same be true in cyber as it is in money laundering, that we are going to be exposed to a lower risk frequency, but if it happens, the amounts are going to be so much larger in our space?
Yeah.
But I've got the director of the enforcement division at the SEC saying, this is 4 years ago, admittedly, saying he found it hard to believe that the industry, by which he meant the securities industry as a whole, is fulfilling its obligations with this level of reporting. So I think there is a cultural difference. I think maybe the payments industry has been at this much longer, and it's the whole purpose of this session to some extent.
But I do think, to Andy's point, even if it may be low today, the question is what could happen in the future, and that's what we need to be prepared for.
No, good point. Anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about this session. I mean, this level of preparedness, because we need to flip back between these a bit. But the story is, when we asked the audience whether their organization is well prepared to recover from a disruptive cyber attack, only 13% of people said. It's gone up now to 17% of people said they were very confident they could do that. You've got half the audience saying they're not confident. And if we flip to what they think about their counterparties, can we see the next one? Yeah. They're not confident their counterparties. So they think they're doing a reasonable job themselves, but their counterparties are doing a terrible job. This is like the average driver problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
But this doesn't surprise any of us, does it?
No,
Colin,
no, it
Colin,
doesn't.
you've been very
It
quiet.
doesn't. And then that's the same conclusion as our working group came up with. Last year we wrote a paper on cybersecurity risk. It was risk assessment within security services, and then we felt, well, what is the next thing that we need to do? And I think we felt that, well, we have all these frameworks, but sooner or later, a bad situation is likely to happen. So then we felt as a working group, well, what is it that ISSA could really help with here? So we talked about playbooks, it's incident management, incident recovery playbooks. And through the working group, we felt that actually individual firms, they largely have their own playbooks for what would happen if they were compromised. But as this suggests, there's less confidence in if a major counterparty is compromised of that firm. So we looked at that and felt, well, actually there seems to be a gap here in relation to firms have their own incident management playbooks, but they don't consider so much what they would do if they are the non-compromised party. But one of their major counterparties was compromised. So what we've been doing is trying to assess, well, what can we provide to the industry that helps in that regard. So we started by, of course, looking out into the industry to see if anybody else is looking at that. And we found that in the US, there's an organization called FSARC who've created a register of scenarios, if you like, in different businesses in different parts of financial services, and from their scenarios, they've developed pretty detailed incident management playbooks. So we touched base with those guys. We coordinated with those. We said from an ISSA perspective, we're looking at this from security services. What do you think? They've already had some ideas on this. So in coordination, I'll just say coordination. It was much more than that, really. But we looked at certain approaches, and that led us down the line of thinking, well, from an ISSA perspective, if we consider use cases, scenarios of cyber events, so whether it's a major CSD is disrupted, or a major global custodian or a local custodian is disrupted, what would the non-compromised party do? So we've been over the course of this year having a number of working groups and putting together a document which really sets out quite a practical guide in relation to, well, what would you do on incident day? What would you do on recovery day, on resumption day +1, and then the post-mortem? So we're trying to set out a variety of practical steps and considerations that firms should consider as part of managing through that incident, which is not them, they're the non-compromised party. Because we think that's where there seems to be a gap.
Okay, so it's a focus on the practical steps. Could we bring up our questions, the answers to
Dominic,
questions?
can you just go back one
The next
question?
two, just bring them up anyway while you're saying something, Colin. But
So the piece I was surprised on this is half of us are not confident our own firm can survive a cyber attack. And that to me is more worrying than any other thing we expected to see. And so, well, I was sitting there when we had the workshop on cyber, and we decided the route was to go about how we recover as an event happens somewhere else. I think we need to reflect in ourselves and think about, if we're not confident about how we survive a cyber attack in our own firms, we need to go back and do some more work. And there is, as Dominic said, many frameworks out there for people to look at, but that 50% stat is a concern to me.
So I think this is a reflection of what is still happening with respect to the mindset in organizations, where there's been now a transition from focusing on security
Okay.
which a lot of the frameworks address, right? So this framework, the ISO framework, it's all about protection and securing. Yes, there is an aspect of recovery that's part of the NIST framework, but we're seeing now this shift from thinking not about if something is going to happen, but when it happens. And
Yeah.
let's assume that a bad thing will happen, and
Yeah.
what are you going to do to recover? So I would say over the last 2 years, there's really been this shift to resilience and recovery. So, and a number of firms are still working through that right now. So I think
About
that's what
half
that
of them.
reflects. Correct. So
Yeah, no, you're right, quite right, Colin. It is a much more worrying statistic. Could we have the next answers up? Is anybody from the floor burning to ask a question at this point? It's an opportunity if you would like to, or make an observation. No? Okay, you haven't started answering these questions yet. Please get busy on your phones. We're very interested in your answers too. This is the same model as we've just applied to cyber risk. You know, we're asking how confident you are in your own business, but also how confident you are in terms of your counterparties. Okay, well, the data is starting to come in. Could we perhaps just, while this is happening, could we have a little show of hands? How many of you have absorbed the ISSA financial crime compliance principles? How many of you have heard of them, let's say?
that's good.
So I'd say that's about half the audience, no? How many of you are familiar with the SWIFT customer security program? That's pretty much, including the people working for SWIFT, which is not unexpected. But that's, awareness of CSP is a little bit higher, but not hugely so. So, you know, a lot of the data we're seeing is people haven't absorbed these principles yet into their day-to-day business because they're not that familiar with them, perhaps.
It's definitely one of the challenges, isn't it? But if this is actually the same question we just had about cyber, and it was quite a deliberate choice that we didn't have don't know as an option. And that's, in the case of the financial crime compliance principles, of course, this is really about how you need to tune your customer KYC due diligence programs to take account of the way that security is intermediated and interconnected. How we need to recognize the fact that in many, many jurisdictions, we do not look through our customers' accounts to the accounts of the end investors, yet we are exposed as a matter of money laundering regulation, sanctions control, and so on and so forth, to the actions of our customers and investors. That's what these are seeking to regulate. CSP is giving you the baseline for performing due diligence on your counterparts, on your customers. And you know, the difference is that I suspect, at least in the security space, even if we're aware of CSP, and even if our own IT security people are filling it out and submitting it to SWIFT, I bet you not very many of us in securities are poring over the results of the CSP self-attestations submitted by our customers and our counterparties, analyzing those and developing risk-based complementary controls as we would when we do AML-related due diligence. So I think that for me is the set of questions we need to get our arms around here.
If you were asking people to leave the room, one thing to remember, would it be important to say you've got to check the customers rather than the transactions? And I was talking a few minutes ago about how few securities transactions are reported. Maybe that's missing the point. You've actually got to understand who the counterparty is, who the customer is.
It's definitely, well, I think there are two answers to that. One is, you're right, individual transactions. You've got to look at patterns, and you've got to look at where the securities transaction fits into, if you like, the wider set of contracts which are going on. And we say, I mean, at Clearstream, we say, actually, you probably need to look at the security as much as you need to look at the customer. For example, if you want to identify an unusual transaction, That's really difficult if you have an omnibus account, which actually, if you think about it, just pools the decisions of multiple end actors. But if you look at an individual security, then you know the patterns of trading, the patterns of settlement are going to be evenly distributed or distributed according to a certain pattern, and you could analyze that and you can work out what's unusual. But much of the money laundering in securities that goes on is by people investing in vehicles that they already control. That's the key thing. The key thing is to identify close relations, hidden close relations between investors and issuers. Because after all, if you want to steal a really big amount of money, you've got to pretend to invest in something.
I've now brought up the second of the pair, where we're looking at how effectively they think their counterparties are applying these principles. And whilst you're seeing the similar pattern we saw with the cybersecurity, that people think they're doing a better job than their counterparties are. Although it was 47% effectively in our own firm. It's now 75% effectively among the counterparties. But it is a lower vote at this point. We might see that change. Please carry on voting and vote on the questions, before we get to them, because that'll help us speed along.
Well, that will be kind of interesting. As we were saying, I said everybody thinks they're a better driver than average, and Colin piped up and said, not me.
Not me.
That's kind of what this is saying. Mm-hmm. We think we're doing it badly, but our counterparties are doing it better. That's interesting.
But we had 18% saying they were doing it very effectively in their own organization. Here we've got 0.
True.
Saying they're doing it very effectively. No, because I said that. I think somebody just did that to annoy me, actually.
But it does come down to this question of where's your exposure, and I think in both cyber and in financial crime compliance is the weakest link in the chain. So if you don't believe your counterpart is doing it effectively in either, that's got to be your concern.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Anyway, we must move on, I think, and talk about what you actually do about this. Could you bring up the next question, which should be about the level of senior management attention, and we'd be interested to know what you think about this, because who in your firm owns this problem? How high up the hierarchy does ownership of this problem actually go? Colin, what's your experience of talking to members of ISSA? Do you think there is an issue here of lack of senior management attention to this issue, or lack of senior management grip?
I think it is changing, but I would say that I'm with the 91% at the moment, which no doubt will change that figure immediately. But the cash payments has been the focus, and it is where the biggest fines have been received, and therefore it is higher on people's attention. But I do think from the work that the ISSA groups are doing, raising attention on this, and as Andrew Gray said earlier, there needs to be consideration for this. I think that is occurring now, but there is still more money being spent on small cash payments than potentially on large security movements and redemptions.
As a firm that deals primarily with securities, I would tell you that this is one of the top priorities for the firm, certainly from a risk management perspective, and looking at the level of engagement from our board or senior management, the funding that we decide on for our budgets for the year. Cybersecurity is a top priority.
But do we think that we got the right, when you think about cybersecurity, firms are going to be hugely focused on this, and it is going to be a top risk consideration for them, particularly from the perspective of protecting themselves.
Yep.
And there'll be a tremendous amount of money spent on that. But do you think there's enough focus on your counterparty, your client cybersecurity, and that coming into that impacting the firm in some way?
Yes.
Either whether it's a vendor,
So I spoke about this on an earlier panel. We've invested a lot in our third-party risk management program, which focuses on all aspects of risk that are introduced by connected parties, whether they be clients or vendors or service providers.
Yeah.
And a big chunk of that investment or that focus is on cybersecurity and technology risk management. So yes, that has definitely been enhanced. And we are rolling out a program that's similar to the SWIFT CSP program for our clients as well, where they have to attest that they have had an independent assessment of their cybersecurity capabilities versus a standard framework. So there is a lot more focus on that now.
But I think that in many ways doesn't surprise me, but I think it's not ultimately justified. So about 6 years ago, Andrew, you and I and Jim and Joseph and a few other people in this room, we got together in a castle in Switzerland, and we tried to put together an answer to a question.
Were you in a dungeon?
No, it was much plusher than that. It was Wolfsburg, actually, but life in the securities industry is tough. And Adam Zubin had got up here at Cybos, well, here in Boston, just a couple of months before, and he'd said something like, I'm going to force you all to go to beneficial owner accounting unless you sort out the problem of omnibus accounts and their vulnerability. He had a focus at that time as director of OFAC on sanctions evasion and so on and so forth. But when we looked at the problem, the extraordinary thing, and this was in, I guess, back end of 2013, we could not find any regulatory guidance from any regulator in the world on how to deal with money laundering, KYC, etc., in relation to securities, more recent than 2004. So the regulators themselves have been drawn very much to payments. Indeed, in 2013, early 2014, you had two enforcement actions, one in AML in relation to BBH and penny stock abuse, and one on sanctions enforcement, and that was Clearstream in relation to Iran. And the interesting thing is that those were really the first public enforcement actions taken by any regulator in relation to securities. And yet, if you think about it, the very biggest money laundering cases on the planet have all involved securities. So it was also the regulators who I think were misinformed. I think they're backfilling that gap now, and that's the reason why we need to act. And cyber is kind of the same. Just because people are stealing money, using, in this case, cyber tools, doesn't mean that they're just going to target the payments colleagues. They're just as capable of targeting us. And the more that the payments colleagues invest in effective controls and effective resilient regimes, and the less we don't, the more vulnerable we're going to be relatively, because these guys are going to say, whoa, look, they put a new lock on the door, but they've left that one open.
Yep.
And I think we as market infrastructure will have to raise the bar on the level of due diligence scrutiny that we apply to our customers in the cyber area.
Okay. I've called up the next question, but I'd be interested to know whether you think, the principles here mount a robust defense of omnibus accounts for a variety of reasons. You brought this up. I just wonder if and I know what you think, Mark, so let's not ask you. I wonder what Andy and Andrew and Colin think about, are omnibus accounts going to survive in the long term? The regulatory position is quite mixed, isn't it? But do you think the industry can continue to defend those over the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Well, I think probably, as Mark said, not without doing something. Is kind of my view, and I think the principle.
A lot's going to depend on the KYC, how effective that is, right?
Yeah, but I think the principles and the ability to have the opportunity to look through where necessary based on triggers, I think is going to be a very important part. If you can't do that, it's a very difficult thing to answer.
Colin, we can't tempt you to expatiate on this. I know it's an awkward one.
I think the world is changing at a pace where forecasting 5, 10 years in the future is probably a foolish thing to do, but I'll try. Say if the world moves more to distributed ledger technologies, such as they're doing now in chess in Australia, then you end up, I think, with much more of a beneficial owner being the owner of a record on the CSD, just because the way that works and the way you can set it up, hopefully with the less cost. But I think as technology increasingly allows the beneficial owner to be identified at the lowest level, and the push for tax compliance carries on, I think the omnibus model will be under pressure.
I do think, though, it's a mistake to believe that knowing and keeping records on the end investor means the end of the omnibus account. The purpose of the omnibus account is to enable transfer ownership in securities elsewhere than at the upper tier. It allows ownership to be exchanged in all sorts of different places. It brings in, therefore, scale economies into the process, particularly for smaller markets. It also introduces competition. But the technology will permit data on end investors to complement that structure. But it would be a huge mistake to throw the baby out of the bathwater and say, we need end beneficial owner accounts in order to know the end beneficial owner. That's actually a non sequitur. And I think there the technology can help us navigate our way out of the hole.
I don't disagree. I'm just saying there's a challenge.
Okay, well, we've got a bit more data here, which is about how
This is your question.
effective people are on this subject of KYC ultimately. This is just asking them how formal their processes of the CSP, but it's an aspect of the same thing. How effective are these organizations with their internal process? If you're trying to look into defend omnibus accounts, you need to have internal processes which make that pretty watertight. Let's bring up the next question now, because I think this goes to the heart of the matter about inside the organization. Who do you think in your organization should have responsibility? Where does the buck stop on this subject inside your organization? I'm desperate to ask you what you think, but we mustn't preempt the audience. And
We
give them
could
any
tell
guidance.
them that we deliberately didn't give you a don't know option.
Okay. That's good.
Because this is about internal governance, isn't it? And does the industry can ISSA give us an ideal governance model for cyber risk and financial compliance?
Yeah, I don't know whether we have an ideal governance model, but
Does it have to vary by organisation?
I think it does. I think there was a previous question in relation to, is there a formal process to review the CSP attestations? Well, actually, it was interesting. I think it came up with about 73% of firms said they do have that, which is actually that was 73%. There you go. I thought that was actually pretty good. It was good to see that.
In fact, go back one before this as well. I think it's quite an interesting answer, which we rather jumped over. The question, are your KYC, ML sanction screening operating in separate silos? This one here. So, inside the firm, this data isn't being brought together.
That's also pretty interesting. I think that there ought to be a bit of an overlap. Actually, I think.
But I would say that at least most frameworks I've seen bring these bits of data together when we do things like risk tolerance statements and within our corporate risk framework. So even though they may be operating in separate silos, the actual work that's being done for the due diligence may be done in separate silos. It does come together.
I think that's right. I think that's right. I think there's data points as well. So for example, you may have country risk ratings as part of your AML governance, but you'd also have that as you may also have that as part of your cybersecurity review and governance. So I think you're right. Maybe it operates in silos, but there are points that are the
where
same.
the data come together.
Yeah, which help you form your decision.
Can we jump forward to the
go back
question
to
about level of the organization, Chief Information Security
Yes,
Officer,
that
that
was
one. So what level of the organization
Yeah, I
is being
wanted to
brought
come back to
together?
that one.
Yeah, no, me too. Yes.
So it's the ninth question I think we had. Roll forward 2. Yeah, this is the one.
So I'm a chief risk officer, so I like that answer.
Yeah, the buck stops with you.
Well, and our structure is that the chief information security officer or chief security officer actually reports to me. So it's within the risk organization as opposed to within the technology organization.
I think what's interesting, though, there is an unevenness to that. I mean, this is a new discipline. It's only relatively recently, isn't it, that we've worked out that we should be doing cyber risk assessments on our customers, you know, in much the same way we do op risk assessments. And I know when we started out at this, people in Swift were joking, you know, the guy who's responsible for this is the one who doesn't come to the meeting.
Right.
And it's interesting to see that the pieces are not landed in a coherent way yet. There is clearly not a best practice or even the most popular practice.
And there is a link, I will say, for the cybersecurity program that we're rolling out for customers between what that group will do and our counterparty credit risk organization, which looks in general at counterparty risk for our customers, and they provide an input.
Maybe
to that
we
risk
should have
assessment.
included the credit officer there. Yeah.
We've got one final question for you all here to address, which I think will be quite telling. Anyone in the audience want to ask a question? We have about 2 minutes left. If anyone has something they want to say or make a statement, you can start voting on this question now. Do you when you would consider this a question of cyber risk and financial crime compliance, is your main priority to protect your own business or is it to protect your customers' assets? Ooh. Their heart is in the right place so far, I think.
No, we shouldn't influence the voting. Right?
I know.
It's,
We shouldn't really be showing you the vote as you do it, because it does influence people's behaviour.
You were heard, Dominic.
Okay, so what's happened here? Have we lost our...
No, they were responding to your request.
Oh, I see, you can do it. It was my mistake. Yeah, I wasn't thinking, sorry.
Well, I would hope that the 60% are all custodians, at least.
I want to talk about the 41%, because I think they understand their organisations better.
Well, look, we kept the business going, but all the customers' assets have been stolen.
So the business will not
I
grow
don't want to
anymore.
make that call to the audit committee, right?
It seems to me you have to.
We have a question at last. Thank you.
Hi. First of all, I think you have some questions via Slido. And secondly, how on earth would you say that you can maintain, how would you protect your customers' assets if you didn't maintain business continuity? If your systems are corrupted or whatever, you have no clue what your customers are holding. Are they really protected?
Yeah.
So I don't see these as actually one or the other. They are basically
I
the same.
completely agree with you.
Yeah.
These aren't mutually exclusive.
Absolutely
And in
right.
fact, in the case of a cyber disruption, you would not want to restart business until you knew exactly what state your data was in, including your customer data.
Which is exactly why so many of us find the 2R RTO sometimes challenging in certain cyber resilience frameworks.
It is a spectrum, right?
Yep.
Depending on the nature.
How
of
can I see the
attack.
questions that have been sent?
You should have them, Dominic.
Can you show me?
I'm the risk guy, not the technology guy.
Yeah. He reports to you, the technology guy. Is he in the room? Right?
It's not here. It was on your screen before.
Yeah. I'm sorry I missed your questions. We're sort of running out of time here, but let's have a look.
No, they're not there.
No, I can't see them.
No, they're not there.
No.
You did just have them open, but I think it was by
They
accident,
disappeared.
Dominic.
No, I'm pressing all the buttons on here.
Perhaps you've been attacked and your data has been
We've
taken
been hacked.
because we didn't put data loss, which is the other of the third vector in cyber risk, isn't it?
Are you going to come and show me? Oh, brilliant, thank you. I'd just like to, I know we're out of time here, but I'd like to see what people had to say. Okay. If DTCC was compromised, would a US public holiday be pronounced to give the market time to recover? That's a yes or no for you, Andrew.
Sorry, what was the question?
If the DTCC was compromised, would a US public holiday be announced to give the market time to recover?
It depends on the nature of the compromise.
You see why this guy's too clever for me. How can ISSA drive change in the SWIFT standards to make the beneficiary details in free of payments messages mandatory, as with MT 103 and 202 cover messages?
Through the country user groups. Oh, it's technically correct.
Oh, yeah, so
answer.
get involved in creating standards. How can you combat fraud when securities transactions are arguably more complex and less transparent than payments? Yeah, I mean, it's hard, isn't it? That's what this is about.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's right. How do you teach the less well-informed market segment, i.e. the firms that don't attend SIBOS? How do you reach the parts can ISSA reach the parts that even SIBOS cannot?
Probably not, to be honest. We can try.
I think through the due diligence
The stuff is
frameworks.
published, it's all available on the website, isn't it?
To be fair, I think through the due diligence framework. So the way that works is quite coherent. You ask your customers, your institutional customers, whether they are compliant with those principles. That means they need to go out and they need to get them. And we find that there are a very, very large number of our customers who are not ISSA members, who don't even come to SIBOS, who are quite comfortable answering that question in the affirmative. So it's through the due diligence frameworks, exactly as SWIFT has done with the CSP, ISSA has done with the financial crime compliance principles, that you can bind in your whole network. Because in an interconnected world, none of us is stronger than the weakest link in our network, as you said earlier, Colin.
You could argue that some of the smaller banks have a much higher interest in doing this job properly than the large ones. If you get cut off from a correspondent banking network, it's kind of over, isn't it?
Correct.
Just one last question, because we are over time now. What will it take for the securities industry to focus on cyber? Do we need a massive fraud to change? We were talking about this earlier, to change culture.
No, I think I agree with Andrew's point earlier. I think people are focused on cyber, and Andy and I were in London earlier in the summer. There was massive interest from many different segments of the market looking at cyber, and people are focusing on it and spending money on it.
Yep.
I hope it doesn't take the massive fraud.
Okay, we better stop there. Thank you to the audience, and please thank our panelists in the traditional manner.